I was a bit nervous as I pulled up to the haunted lodge, my home for the next week. The old creaky building looked like it was straight out of a horror movie, but I couldn't wait to explore and hopefully have my own paranormal experience. I grabbed my bags from the car and made my way inside. The interior was dimly lit and had a musty smell to it. As I walked down the hallway, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I brushed it off and made my way to my room, which was surprisingly cozy despite the eerie surroundings. I unpacked my bags and decided to take a walk around the lodge to explore. As I walked through the main living area, I heard a faint whisper coming from the corner of the room. I froze, unsure of what to do next. Suddenly, the whisper grew louder and I could hear a voice saying, "Get out!" I quickly turned around, but there was no one there. I tried to shake it off, telling myself that it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. As the sun began to set, I decided to head back to my room and get some rest. But as soon as I lay down, I heard footsteps coming from the hallway. I sat up and peered out into the darkness, but again, there was no one there. Over the next few days, strange things continued to happen. Doors would open and close on their own, footsteps echoed through the halls, and objects would move without explanation. One night, as I was lying in bed, I heard a woman's voice crying out for help. I jumped out of bed and followed the sound to the attic. As I entered the dusty space, I saw a figure standing in the corner. It was the ghost of a former guest who had died in a tragic accident while staying at the lodge. She told me her story, how she had fallen down the stairs and broken her neck. She had been trapped in the lodge ever since, unable to move on. I felt a mix of fear and compassion for the ghost. I knew I had to help her find peace. I spent the next few days researching and found a way to communicate with the other side. I sat down in the attic and began to speak to the ghost, telling her that she could move on and find peace. I felt her presence grow fainter and fainter until she was finally gone. The lodge felt different after that. It was as if the energy had shifted and the ghost was no longer trapped there. I felt a sense of peace and closure. But my experience at the haunted lodge wasn't over yet. As I was packing up my things to leave, I noticed a strange symbol etched into the wooden floorboards of my room. It was a symbol I had never seen before, and it gave me an uneasy feeling. I decided to do some more research and discovered that the symbol was associated with a local cult that had practiced dark rituals in the area years ago. It was said that the cult had made a deal with a demon in exchange for power and knowledge. I couldn't believe it. Had I been staying in a lodge that was not only haunted but also connected to dark forces? As I drove away from the haunted lodge, I couldn't help but feel a mix of fear and fascination. The experience opened my eyes to a world beyond our own, a world of ghosts, demons, and the unknown, and I knew that I would never forget it. I was new to the job as a park ranger, but I was eager to explore the vast wilderness that surrounded me. As I patrolled the park on foot, I noticed something strange in the distance. There was a figure dressed in an old ranger uniform, and he seemed to be beckoning me to come closer. I hesitated at first, but my curiosity got the best of me. As I approached the figure, I realized that it was not a living person at all, but the ghost of a ranger who had died on duty years ago. He was known as the Phantom Ranger, and his legend had been passed down among the rangers for generations. The Phantom Ranger's uniform was old and weathered, and his face was covered by a bandana. Despite his ghostly appearance, he seemed to be friendly and welcoming. He greeted me with a nod and gestured for me to follow him. I hesitated again, but the Phantom Ranger seemed to know where he was going. He led me deep into the forest, past the well-worn trails, and into areas that were rarely explored. As we walked, he pointed out various landmarks and told me stories about the history of the park. As the sun began to set, the Phantom Ranger led me to an old cabin deep in the woods. The cabin was long abandoned, but it was clear that it had once been used as a ranger station. The Phantom Ranger gestured for me to go inside, and I cautiously followed. Inside the cabin, I saw old maps and equipment, but what caught my eye was a photo on the wall. It was a group photo of rangers taken many years ago. The Phantom Ranger pointed to himself in the photo and then to a young ranger standing beside him. It was clear that this young ranger had been the Phantom Ranger's partner. The Phantom Ranger then gestured for me to sit down, and he began to tell me the story of his death. He and his partner had been patrolling the park when they received a call about a lost hiker. They searched for hours, but they were unable to find the hiker before nightfall. As they were making their way back to the ranger station, they stumbled upon a group of poachers. The poachers opened fire, and the Phantom Ranger's partner was killed instantly. The Phantom Ranger was gravely wounded, but he managed to make it back to the ranger station before he died. After he finished his story, the Phantom Ranger gestured for me to leave the cabin. As I stepped outside, I saw that the sun had set and that the forest was now shrouded in darkness. I suddenly felt very alone and vulnerable, but the Phantom Ranger gestured for me to follow him once again. He led me back through the forest, and as we walked, I heard strange noises in the distance. It sounded like footsteps, but when I turned around, there was no one there. The Phantom Ranger seemed to sense my fear, and he gestured for me to keep following him. Finally, we reached the edge of the forest, and I saw my patrol car parked nearby. The Phantom Ranger nodded to me and then disappeared into the darkness. As I drove back to the ranger station, I couldn't help but think about the Phantom Ranger's story. His sacrifice had been a reminder that as park rangers, we put ourselves in danger every day to protect the wilderness and those who visit it. From that day on, I never forgot the Phantom Ranger and the lessons he had taught me. Whenever I patrolled the park, I felt his presence nearby, and I knew that he was watching over me and the wilderness that he had given his life to protect. I was on a routine patrol of the park when I received a distress call from a group of campers. They claimed that they were being attacked by a malevolent spirit that had possessed them. I had heard of strange occurrences in the park before, but this was unlike anything I had ever experienced. As I arrived at the campsite, I saw the group of campers huddled together in fear. They were pale and trembling, and their eyes seemed to be glazed over. I approached them cautiously, unsure of what to expect. As I got closer, I noticed that they were all muttering incoherently, and they seemed to be unaware of their surroundings. It was as if they were in a trance-like state, and the malevolent energy that surrounded them was palpable. I tried to speak to them, but they did not respond. I attempted to break their trance, but nothing seemed to work. It was clear that they were under the control of something sinister. As I investigated the campsite, I found evidence of a ritual that had taken place. There were strange symbols etched into the trees, and the ground was covered in what looked like blood. It was clear that something dark and dangerous had been summoned. Suddenly, I heard a low growl coming from the woods. It was deep and menacing, and it sent shivers down my spine. I knew that I had to act quickly if I wanted to survive. I tried to contact my superiors for backup, but my radio was not working. It seemed as if the malevolent spirit was interfering with our communication equipment. As I tried to come up with a plan, I saw the possessed campers begin to move towards me. They were now working together, and their movements were coordinated and purposeful. It was as if they were being controlled by a single entity. The possessed campers began to circle me, and I knew that I was in trouble. They lunged at me with incredible speed and strength, and I barely managed to dodge their attacks. I tried to defend myself, but it was no use. They were too strong and too fast. It was as if they were possessed by a demon. As I fought for my life, I realized that I needed to find a way to break the spell that had been cast on the campers. I remembered a story that my grandfather had told me about an ancient talisman that was said to ward off evil spirits. I quickly made my way back to my patrol car and retrieved the talisman from my glove compartment. As I held it up, I felt a surge of energy run through my body. It was as if the talisman had awakened a power inside me that I never knew existed. The possessed campers recoiled at the sight of the talisman, and I knew that I had a chance. I began to recite an incantation that my grandfather had taught me, and as I did so, the malevolent energy that had surrounded the campers began to dissipate. The campers fell to the ground and their eyes began to clear. They looked around in confusion, and it was clear that they had no memory of what had just happened. As I helped them to their feet, I knew that I had saved their lives. I had defeated the malevolent spirit that had possessed them, and I had protected the park from its dark energy. From that day on, I never forgot the lesson that I had learned. The wilderness was full of unknown dangers, and as park rangers, it was our duty to protect those who ventured into it. But we could not do it alone. We needed to rely on our instincts and our knowledge of the land, and we needed to be prepared for anything that might come our way. The experience changed me forever. I realized that there were forces at work in the world that were beyond my understanding. I knew that I could never let my guard down and that I needed to be vigilant at all times. As I finished packing up my gear, I heard a rustling in the bushes behind me. I turned to see a dark figure emerging from the underbrush. It was a man, dressed in tattered clothing and covered in dirt. He looked at me with wild eyes and began to stumble towards me. I realized with horror that he too was possessed by the malevolent spirit. I quickly pulled out the talisman, hoping that it would have the same effect on him as it did on the campers. But to my surprise, it did not work. The man continued to advance towards me, his movements becoming more and more erratic. I knew that I had to act quickly if I wanted to survive. I pulled out my gun and aimed it at the man, hoping that the sight of it would deter him. But it was no use. He kept coming towards me, his eyes filled with a terrifying intensity. Just as I was about to pull the trigger, the man suddenly stopped in his tracks. He looked around in confusion as if he had no memory of what had just happened. I knew that I had to get out of there before the malevolent spirit had a chance to possess me too. I quickly packed up my gear and headed back to my patrol car, my heart racing with fear. As I drove away from the campsite, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, lurking in the darkness. I knew that I had defeated the malevolent spirit, but I couldn't help but wonder what other dangers lay ahead. From that day on, I vowed to protect the park and its visitors from any and all threats. I knew that the wilderness was a dangerous place, but I was determined to face it head-on. As I drove back to the ranger station, I couldn't help but feel a sense of pride and accomplishment. I had faced down a malevolent spirit and emerged victorious. I knew that I had done my duty as a park ranger, and that I had saved the lives of those who had been under its influence. The experience taught me a valuable lesson about the power of the supernatural and the importance of being prepared for anything. As I looked out at the wilderness around me, I knew that I was ready for whatever the park had in store for me next. I was assigned to a remote fire tower deep in the heart of the forest. The tower was old and rusted, with creaky stairs and a rickety railing that made me nervous every time I climbed to the top. But I was determined to do my job and keep watch over the trees. At first, everything was quiet. I spent my days scanning the horizon, looking for smoke or other signs of danger. But as the nights grew longer, I began to notice strange things happening. It started with the sounds. I would hear footsteps on the stairs when no one was there, and whispers in the dark that made my skin crawl. But when I turned on my flashlight, there was never anyone there. Then, one night, I saw something that chilled me to the bone. It was the ghostly figure of a man dressed in an old ranger uniform standing at the edge of the tower. He looked at me with empty eyes, and then he was gone. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination. But the strange occurrences continued. The radios would pick up static, and I could hear voices that sounded like they were from another time. And then there were the fires. The first one was small, just a patch of grass that had caught on fire. I put it out quickly, but it left me with an uneasy feeling. The second one was bigger and harder to control. It was as if the forest itself was fighting against me. And then the third fire happened. It was the biggest one yet, and it had started right at the base of the tower. I knew that I had to get out of there, but the stairs were engulfed in flames. I was trapped, but then something miraculous happened. The ghostly figure of the ranger appeared before me, holding out his hand. "Come with me," he said, his voice echoing in my mind. "I'll take you to safety." I hesitated for a moment, but then I knew that I had no other choice. I took his hand, and then everything went black. When I woke up, I was lying on the ground, surrounded by firefighters. They told me that they had found me outside of the tower, but they couldn't explain how I had gotten there. As I looked back at the tower, I knew the truth. The ghostly ranger had saved my life, but at a terrible cost. The tower was still burning, and it was clear that it would never be rebuilt. But that was not the end of the horror. As the years went on, I began to hear stories from other rangers who had been stationed at that same tower. They had all experienced the same strange occurrences, and they all had their own stories of the ghostly ranger. And then there were the fires. They continued to happen, each one more intense than the last. Some said that it was the forest seeking revenge for the ranger's death, while others claimed that it was the ghost himself, trying to get revenge on those who had abandoned him. But I knew the truth. The ranger was not a hero, but a vengeful spirit who was bound to the tower for all eternity. And as long as that tower stood, the horror would never end.